Nathan Doyle wasn't the type to engage in petty neighborhood politics. He had spent over 2 decades working in systems design and safety engineering before quietly transitioning into independent consulting, building a modest but comfortable life around logic, efficiency, and structure. His house, tucked at the bend of a cul-de-sac in a mid-sized New England town, wasn't lavish but was, in every sense, deliberate, built not for display but for functionality, privacy, and longevity. What made it particularly unique was the narrow city-registered emergency access lane that ran along the rear of his property, a small paved path that connected to a service road used by maintenance crews and, when needed, emergency responders. Most residents didn't even realize it was technically an evacuation route. Nathan did, because he had helped draft its access blueprint during a contract with the city years earlier. It was this access lane that prompted him to install a hydraulic bollard at his rear driveway, a heavy-duty, pressure-sensitive column that could rise or lower at the press of a switch, blocking unauthorized vehicles from obstructing the only legal emergency exit on his block. It wasn't installed out of paranoia or ego, but necessity. 3 years prior, a house 2 doors down had caught fire after a faulty propane line in the patio grill exploded. The fire department arrived within 4 minutes, but by then the lane had already been blocked by a landscaping trailer left idling behind Nathan's fence, forcing the responders to take a longer, winding path through the opposite end of the neighborhood. Those minutes had cost the family their kitchen, most of the second floor, and, though not often mentioned out loud, a golden retriever named Jasper. Nathan, who had been called in as a witness during the insurance investigation due to his role in the original evacuation schematic, had taken it as a harsh but important reminder. When systems fail, lives are affected. After that incident, and after securing the appropriate permits from both the city's Department of Safety Infrastructure and his insurance provider, Nathan personally oversaw the installation of the hydraulic bollard. It wasn't a cheap addition, and it wasn't one most people would consider necessary. But Nathan didn't care about appearances. He cared about what worked. The system was intelligent but simple. A control box inside his garage, a separate mechanical override by the side gate, and a third, restricted wireless backup triggered only from his home's network. No app, no online portal. Just local control. Bulletproof reliability. There were clearly marked reflective signs on both sides of the lane stating, "Emergency access only, do not block," along with a smaller metal plaque on the ground in front of the bollard base. He had even emailed the neighbors once in polite terms, reminding them that the lane had to remain clear. Karen McKinley either never got the message or chose to ignore it entirely. Karen had moved into the house next door about 18 months ago. She didn't own the property, at least not directly. Tax records listed it under a management firm based out of Phoenix, Arizona, but the tenants rotated rarely, and Karen had been the sole occupant since arrival. In her early 60s, with immaculately dyed hair, large sunglasses, and a rotating inventory of high-end SUVs that bore dealership plates longer than most people test-drove vehicles, Karen had become a staple of local gossip, not because of any great scandal, but because she always seemed to bend the rules in just the right ways to make herself untouchable. She parked where she pleased, ignored bin collection schedules, and once used a leaf blower at 7:30 in the morning for reasons no one could quite understand. Her demeanor was friendly when it suited her, condescending when challenged and passive-aggressive at all other times. It had started with her guests. A friend in a white Mercedes had backed into the emergency lane during a birthday brunch and stayed there for 3 hours. Nathan, noticing this from his rear-facing office window, had walked over and politely asked her to move the vehicle, citing the lane's legal designation. Karen smiled and said she'd pass it along, but the car didn't move until late that afternoon. Then came the deliveries. Catering vans, moving trucks, an inexplicably large hot tub once dropped off and then returned within the same week, all parked squarely across the marked path. Nathan tried to address it diplomatically. Short notes in her mailbox, a brief conversation at the curb, even offering to share the city's official map of emergency access points. Nothing changed. When he finally installed the hydraulic bollard, Karen responded by laughing and asking whether he was planning to start charging for driveway usage now. Over time, Nathan started documenting incidents, not out of spite, but in case the situation escalated into something actionable. He kept a private folder in his home office labeled Access Log, and noted each time a vehicle blocked the lane, how long it remained there, and whether Karen or one of her guests was involved. He didn't contact authorities. He wasn't looking for confrontation. But something about her disregard rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't just careless, it was entitled. As if rules were decorative, and her comfort was more important than the safety of those around her. Still, he kept his distance. The lane remained mostly clear. The bollard, when lowered, was invisible to the casual observer, flush with the pavement. Only those who knew what it was, and knew they weren't supposed to be there, ever had reason to notice it. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. It had been a strange week already. Rainstorms had flooded half the neighborhood. A transformer blew on the next block, knocking out power to 4 houses. Nathan had been working on finalizing an inspection report for a local hospital that was expanding its trauma wing. He was tired, distracted, but not enough to miss the thudding clunk of large tires over his back path just after noon. When he looked through his rear window, he saw Karen's latest acquisition, a sleek gray SUV with temporary tags, parked directly over the emergency exit. Again, not slightly over, not idling, fully parked, wheels turned inward, engine off, doors locked. He stared at it for a long moment, jaw tight, and then pulled out his phone. Not to take a photo, he already had dozens, but to activate the internal security notification system he'd built into the Bollard relay. It was designed to log every lift or drop command for audit purposes. It would timestamp the activation. That mattered to him. That was what evidence looked like. Nathan pressed the mechanical override button, waited 5 seconds, and heard the deep mechanical groan of the bollard rising from the ground. It was never fast. It rose with deliberate force, designed to halt vehicles, not crush them. But this time, there was no gap between the base of the vehicle and the concrete slab. The front wheels began to lift as the reinforced column emerged directly beneath the vehicle's center of gravity. There was a sharp, metallic crunch as steel met undercarriage, followed by the unmistakable hiss of punctured components. The SUV rocked once, teetered, and then settled with its rear axle suspended, back wheels dangling an inch from the ground. The front end remained motionless, locked in place, resting squarely on a now immovable hydraulic column. Karen appeared 15 seconds later, storming out of her house in sandals and a fleece pullover, screaming before she was even within earshot. Karen was already mid-scream before she had even reached the rear fence line, her voice cutting across the quiet like a bone saw, shrill and strangely theatrical, as if she were auditioning for a courtroom drama rather than responding to a parking incident of her own making. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shouted, pointing wildly at the back of her elevated vehicle as if Nathan hadn't just watched the entire sequence unfold in real time. He stood motionless at the gate, not out of fear or hesitation, but because he understood that anything he said now would be used either as ammunition or misdirection. He knew the pattern well. Feign victimhood, escalate emotionally, draw in witnesses, then flip the narrative before facts could take root. Karen excelled at that kind of chaos. It was what allowed her to live without consequences in a neighborhood that otherwise prided itself on order. "I warned you, Karen," Nathan said flatly, not shouting but speaking just loud enough for her to hear over the screech of her indignation. "This is an emergency access lane. You've been informed, multiple times. That bollard is authorized, marked, and not designed to accommodate private vehicles." He gestured toward the large reflective sign just 3 feet from her bumper, the one she had likely walked past dozens of times without so much as a glance. She looked at the sign as if seeing it for the first time, her mouth twitching at the edges, caught between defiance and the creeping realization that maybe she had finally gone one step too far. But the moment passed, and her outrage redoubled, latching onto new footing. "You're insane," she snapped, stepping closer, her finger practically vibrating with fury as she jabbed it toward him. "You could have killed someone." "What if I had been inside the car? What if a child had been in there?" Nathan raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. The SUV had been locked, lights off, parked with mechanical precision. There had been no child, no occupant, and certainly no emergency. But Karen didn't need reality on her side. She just needed volume, emotion, and a sense of spectacle. "I suggest you move back, Karen," he said calmly, gesturing toward the garage where the manual override switch was housed. "The vehicle is resting on an active hydraulic support. If the system senses resistance or movement, it could trigger the safety lockdown. That would delay the reset by several hours and complicate the inspection." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She had already turned toward her phone, dialing with aggressive urgency. Nathan caught a few of the words: property damage, illegal installation, aggression, and knew instantly where this was heading. Within 5 minutes he would have a cruiser at his doorstep, and with it, the inevitable pageantry of neutrality gone wrong. True to prediction, a black and white police vehicle rolled into the cul-de-sac 11 minutes later. Karen had positioned herself theatrically by the rear of the SUV, gesturing dramatically to the officer before he had even exited the car. Nathan, meanwhile, stood near the gate, arms folded, documents in hand. The officer, mid-30s, buzz-cut, cautious gait, approached Karen first, listening with a neutral expression as she recounted what had just occurred in increasingly vivid detail. According to her version, she had briefly pulled into the lane to avoid blocking a delivery truck, and was about to move the car when Nathan had, without warning or provocation, launched a mechanical spike into her undercarriage. She described the device as weaponized, referred to Nathan as unhinged, and suggested that the bollard may have been illegally tampered with for personal revenge. Nathan waited until the officer turned to him before speaking. "The device is a city-registered hydraulic bollard, installed with municipal approval under Permit ID 4817A, he said, handing over a neatly stapled packet. "It's designed to prevent illegal obstruction of emergency egress routes. This access lane is designated for fire, medical, and utility services. It has been blocked 6 times in the past 3 months by this vehicle and others associated with the property at 106 Maple Crescent. I have documented each instance with time-stamped photographs and accompanying notes. This is the 3rd direct obstruction by the complainant's vehicle." The officer flipped through the documents, clearly surprised by the level of detail. "Did you notify her before activating the system?" he asked. "The lane is marked. She's been notified in writing before. I have a copy of that notice, too," Nathan replied. The officer paused, weighing what he was seeing against what he had heard. "Any cameras?" he asked. Nathan nodded. "Footage is stored locally. I can export it if needed, but I prefer to wait until legal counsel is present." That caught Karen's attention, her eyes narrowing as she realized Nathan wasn't reacting like a man who had something to hide. He was measured, prepared, and worse, completely within his rights. In the end, the officer made no arrests, issued no citations, and left with a vague promise to forward the matter to municipal code enforcement for review. Karen was furious. "He could have killed someone and you're not even going to write him up," she shouted at the retreating cruiser. The officer offered no reply. As the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from view, Nathan walked calmly back toward the Bollard control box. "I'll disengage the support once you've arranged for a tow," he said, not looking at her. "Until then, the vehicle isn't safe to operate. The system needs time to depressurize." Karen didn't answer. She stood there for a long moment, her jaw locked, arms crossed, staring at the crushed undercarriage of her SUV like it had betrayed her personally. When she finally stormed off toward her house, Nathan didn't follow. He walked back inside, locked the door, and opened a folder labeled Active Incidents on his desktop. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted. The following morning, he received a formal notice from the city's Public Property Advisory Committee. An administrative review had been opened regarding his emergency system. The language was bureaucratic, but ominous. In light of a recent incident involving potential misuse of public safety infrastructure, your property has been scheduled for an inspection to evaluate compliance with Section 12.9b of the Community Access Act. The inspection was set for the following Monday. No context, no prior complaint reference, just a thinly veiled threat wrapped in procedural formality. Nathan stared at the notice in silence, then set it aside and brewed a second cup of coffee. When he stepped outside that afternoon to inspect the Bollard housing, he noticed something strange. The reflective warning sign had been tampered with. The screws were still in place, but the entire plate had been bent forward, warped as if someone had tried to forcefully tear it off. A faint scrape across the surface suggested a crowbar or wrench. Nathan crouched, running his fingers along the edge, then stood slowly and walked to the fence line. There, on the ground just outside the boundary, sat a discarded pair of cheap work gloves, bright orange, synthetic, unbranded. He didn't touch them. Instead, he took a photo, returned inside, and added the image to the folder. Not for the police, not yet, but because he knew what was happening. This wasn't about a single incident anymore. It was about precedent. Someone had challenged the way things were supposed to work, and now the structure itself was trying to snap back into place, with Karen acting as both agitator and avatar of that unwelcome push. And if he didn't hold his ground, it wouldn't be just his access that vanished. It would be the principle behind it. And principles, once abandoned, are rarely recovered. 3 days after the incident with the SUV and just 2 days before the scheduled inspection, Nathan received a voicemail that made his blood run cold, not because of what was said, but because of who was saying it and how carefully it had been crafted. The message came from a representative of the city's Community Infrastructure Liaison Office, a department so obscure that Nathan had only ever heard of it once, during a zoning appeal a decade prior. The woman on the recording had a steady, polished tone, one developed through years of rehearsing bad news in language that couldn't be litigated. She informed him in precise language that as a part of a preliminary inquiry into private modification of emergency pathways, his property would be undergoing a multidisciplinary compliance review. Nathan didn't need to parse between the lines. This wasn't just an inspection. It was a coordinated escalation, one Karen had almost certainly instigated, but no longer controlled. Now it had moved into the hands of administrators, and the cold neutrality of bureaucracy was often more dangerous than outright hostility. Nathan understood process. He respected it. That's why he immediately reviewed all documentation related to the Bollard installation: permit applications, sign-off letters, engineering specs, photos of the site before and after, correspondence with the city's Safety Infrastructure Office. He scanned every file, verified each signature, and reprinted 3 copies of the key permits. He didn't stop there. He reached out to the original contracting firm, requested a maintenance log, and scheduled an emergency diagnostic on the hydraulic unit, making sure everything was within tolerances. If they were going to audit him, he would hand them a portfolio so complete that any attempt to question it would reek of selective enforcement. But something else had shifted, something he couldn't trace to a form or a policy change. That afternoon, when he returned from his office to find the inspection tags removed from his utility box and the lock replaced with a city-issued seal, he realized that someone had acted preemptively without notifying him. That wasn't protocol. If there was a safety concern about his system, he should have received a red tag notice, or at least a deficiency warning. But there had been no knock, no letter, and no timestamp. Just a new lock and a bright orange sticker marked, "Temporarily disabled. Do not operate." The sticker bore no date, no issuing authority, just a printed barcode and the words, "Active Case, 57C." He stood there for a long time, keys in hand, staring at the modified box, and began to understand what was truly happening. It wasn't just about whether his system was compliant. It was about removing his ability to assert that compliance. Without access to the controls, he could neither operate nor inspect the device himself. It was effectively neutralized, and if someone claimed it wasn't functioning or had been tampered with, he wouldn't be able to offer immediate proof to the contrary. And that was the point. They weren't just looking at the evidence, they were constructing their own timeline. Nathan didn't shout, he didn't rant on the neighborhood forum. Instead, he sent 3 emails. One to the city engineer listed on his original permit, one to the Infrastructure Oversight Ombudsman, and one to his legal counsel. Not a trial attorney, but a meticulous property specialist he had worked with before. A woman named Ruth Conrad, whose strength was in catching exactly the kind of procedural overreach now unfolding. Ruth replied within the hour, requested a copy of all documentation and photographs, and then offered a single line of critical advice. Do not touch the system. Document everything. Let them hang themselves with their own rope. He followed that advice, and it proved wise. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, Nathan watched from his upstairs window as a small crew arrived in an unmarked municipal van. They were not utility workers. No insignia, no badges, no paperwork visible. 2 men, mid-40s, dressed in the kind of generic work gear that meant nothing and everything at once, moved briskly toward the utility box. One held what looked like a scanning device. The other carried a clipboard, though he never wrote anything down. Nathan didn't interfere. He took photographs from his window, time-stamped them, then recorded a short video as the men appeared to open the panel, do nothing visible, and then reseal it with the same tag. The entire process lasted less than 7 minutes. When they left, Nathan stepped outside just long enough to verify that nothing had changed. The sticker was the same. The box was still locked. But something was different. The ground near the base of the Bollard housing was disturbed. Barely, but just enough to suggest recent tampering. A few pebbles scattered where there had been none before. A small scrape in the concrete lip that hadn't existed last week. The following morning brought confirmation of what he feared. A letter arrived not by mail, but hand-delivered in a plain envelope slipped under his garage side door. It bore no city letterhead, but the contents were unmistakably official. A temporary injunction had been filed to prevent further operation of unauthorized mechanical safety infrastructure, pending a full hearing. No date was listed. No court case number, just a directive. Do not activate the device. Any breach of this directive may constitute interference with municipal review and be subject to civil penalty. Nathan sat at his kitchen table, rereading the letter while the city's map of registered access lanes sat open on his laptop. His address was still listed. The Bollard's registration was still valid. The permit still appeared on the city's database, but now, somewhere behind the interface, someone had begun the quiet process of erasing his authority over his own system. This was no longer about safety, it was about control. And someone had decided that Nathan Doyle, in asserting his right to protect an evacuation path, had stepped outside his station. Later that week, Karen made her next move. Not a vehicle this time, but a formal complaint filed with the city's Parking and Access Committee, an obscure group of rotating members appointed more for their business connections than their civic expertise. Her complaint alleged that Nathan's Bollard had created a hazardous condition on shared right-of-way, citing hostile mechanical interference with community navigation. The language was pure nonsense, but it had weight because it was filed within the right office, using the right terminology. Nathan wasn't just being accused of misconduct, he was being painted as a liability. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. Nathan's lawn remained trimmed, his house immaculate, his demeanor calm and professional. But beneath the surface, a complex war had begun. A war not of fists or shouting matches, but of codes, citations, and selective enforcement. And in that war, the person who loses their temper first usually loses everything. So Nathan waited. He gathered. He documented. And when Monday arrived, bringing with it the scheduled inspection, he stood ready with every piece of paper, every photo, every time-stamped video, and a quiet determination not to give them what they wanted. A reaction. They had come for his system. Now they'd have to justify why. The city inspection was scheduled for 9:20 a.m., but the black sedan rolled up at 8:17. Nathan saw it through the front blinds while finishing his coffee, a stainless thermos resting beside a printed folder labeled Access Systems. Permit. He for 4817A. He noted the early arrival not with irritation but with clarity. It meant they were prepared, possibly intending to catch him off guard. The two men who stepped out were dressed not in city uniforms but in tailored civilian attire, one with a messenger bag slung over his shoulder and the other holding a tablet. They looked like auditors, not safety officers, and their body language confirmed it. Efficient, controlled, uninterested in conversation. Nathan met them at the gate before they rang the bell, folder in hand, and offered a firm but measured greeting. They introduced themselves by title, not by name, one as a compliance officer from Property Services, the other from the Public Safety Review Panel. No handshakes, no small talk, just clipped acknowledgments as they requested access to the emergency lane. Nathan walked them through the side gate and down the narrow pathway behind his house, offering no commentary beyond what was strictly necessary. The hydraulic bollard was still in its lowered position, sealed and tagged with the municipal sticker from the prior week. He pointed to the permit number engraved on the steel base plate, then opened the folder and handed them copies of the installation approval, inspection logs, and photos of the original build site. The man with the tablet scanned each document without comment, while the other began walking the length of the access path, measuring with a laser tool and occasionally tapping notes into his device. The whole exchange took under 12 minutes, and not once did either of them ask a single question about Karen or the incident that had prompted the review. When they concluded their site inspection, the man from the Public Safety Review Panel nodded once and said, almost mechanically, "You'll receive a written summary within 7 business days." Nathan, expecting as much, nodded in return and asked, calmly, "Will the injunction on operation remain in place pending review?" The man paused briefly, then answered, "That's standard protocol during active evaluation." And with that they left. No additional notes, no discussion of findings, no indication of whether what they'd seen aligned with what had been alleged. It was procedural ambiguity weaponized. Nathan didn't expect transparency, but the sterile efficiency of it all left him with the uneasy sense that decisions had already been made elsewhere. That evening, Ruth called. She had received a digital copy of the complaint Karen had filed and read it in full. "It's strategically vague," she said, her voice flat but alert. "They're not accusing you of operating illegally. They're questioning whether your system constitutes an unauthorized obstruction under recent amendments to the right-of-way navigation clause. It's obscure, but it gives them leverage." Nathan leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. "But the clause deals with commercial encroachments, dumpsters, private fencing, construction debris." Ruth agreed. "Correct, but it's also been recently applied to mechanical installations not owned by the city. That includes things like automated gates, private barrier arms, and now, apparently, hydraulic bollards." She paused. "It's a reach, but if they apply it, they can override your permit retroactively." Nathan stayed silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "What's the best way to counter it?" Ruth didn't hesitate. "We shift the narrative. We file a counterclaim not against Karen but against procedural inconsistency. Cite prior approvals, city precedent, and usage history. We force them to acknowledge that the system was inspected, documented, and renewed without incident for 3 years. If we show they've selectively enforced a new clause, they'll have to explain why they targeted your installation and not the dozen others like it across the city." Nathan felt a flicker of momentum. Not hope, exactly, but traction. By midweek, the counterclaim was submitted. Ruth handled the legal writing. Nathan provided the records. He also compiled a comparative report of other properties with similar access installations, most of which had no permit visible and had never been subject to enforcement action. The disparity was glaring. On Thursday, he received a certified letter acknowledging receipt of his submission. On Friday, the sticker on his bollard was quietly removed, replaced by a smaller tag that read, "Under interim administrative review, do not tamper." No one contacted him directly. The change had been made in silence, but it was a shift nonetheless. The system wasn't operational, but neither was it condemned. And then, Saturday morning, the real escalation came. Not from the city, but from Karen herself. Nathan was trimming hedges when he heard shouting from the alley behind his house. At first, he assumed it was another neighbor scolding a delivery driver, but when he stepped through the gate, he saw Karen standing directly over the Bollard housing, a man beside her holding a digital camera, snapping photos while she pointed and narrated loudly about unsafe installations and hidden hazards. The man didn't look like press. He had the air of a low-tier contractor, or perhaps someone she'd hired from a listing site. Nathan walked up slowly, keeping his tone even. "This is private property," he said plainly. "You're not authorized to be back here." Karen turned toward him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, this is part of a shared emergency lane, and I'm documenting potential code violations for community review." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He simply pulled out his phone and dialed, not 911, but the direct number for Ruth's office, which had an emergency extension for property access disputes. Karen kept smiling, gesturing to the photographer to keep snapping. Within minutes, Ruth had confirmed that the access lane, while municipally designated, was bounded on Nathan's side by a deeded easement that granted him control over all modifications and maintenance up to the midpoint of the lane. In short, Karen was trespassing. Nathan didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He simply informed her that a formal notice of trespass would be filed and that any future access without municipal escort would be documented and submitted as evidence in the pending case. The photographer hesitated. Karen's smile faltered. They left 2 minutes later without another word. Nathan stood in the alley for a long time afterward, the hedge trimmers forgotten in his hand, the hum of the city dimmed by the tight coil of pressure gathering behind his ribs. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about access. It wasn't even about the Bollard anymore. Karen had found a pressure point in the system, and now she was testing how much force it would take to collapse it entirely. And what made it worse, what made it personal, was that the system was letting her try. The following week unfolded like a sequence of controlled detonations, quiet, precise, and aimed to destabilize Nathan's control without triggering enough noise to draw public scrutiny. At first, the attacks were indirect, almost bureaucratic in nature. His scheduled service appointment with a contracted utility technician was canceled without explanation. A parcel from a supplier arrived 2 days late, its contents incorrectly listed and half-damaged, accompanied by an apology letter that felt automated. When Nathan followed up, the vendor claimed they had received an address change form, apparently submitted through a third-party database syncing tool. No one could explain who authorized it. It was ostensibly a clerical error, but it was the second this month. And while none of these disruptions were conclusive in isolation, together they pointed toward a pattern, one aimed not at property destruction, but at undermining operational reliability, the very principle Nathan had built his life and career around. Then came the municipal letter. It wasn't a citation or a violation notice, but a request for clarification regarding recent infrastructural modifications observed on site. The letter referenced a visual assessment conducted by non-affiliated safety consultants and listed concerns ranging from elevated mechanical response risk to unauthorized grading changes near drainage infrastructure. Nathan read it twice, slowly before placing it on the kitchen counter beside a photograph he had taken weeks earlier, the one showing Karen and her photographer associate crouched near the Bollard base. He had been so focused on the trespass itself that he hadn't noticed what they were doing with the camera. They hadn't just been documenting the Bollard. They had been photographing the slope of the alley, the grading around the housing, the minor erosion lines formed after last month's rain. Karen had submitted a report, or at least the imagery, and now the city was using it to question foundational aspects of the installation that had never been challenged during the original permit review. Nathan contacted Ruth immediately, and by the following morning she had filed a response packet. It included engineering diagrams, photographs pre- and post-installation, and copies of city inspector sign-offs, all clearly confirming that the grading had not changed beyond the allowable threshold. But the damage had been done, not structurally, but narratively. Someone had successfully reframed the conversation from, "Is this system allowed to exist?" to, "Is this system secretly dangerous?" which, as Ruth pointed out, was harder to disprove because it relied on speculative language, not violations of code. Meanwhile, Karen became bolder. Her SUV had been replaced. Whether by insurance or private funds, Nathan didn't know, but the new vehicle was parked conspicuously close to the lane again, not directly over the Bollard, but within 2 feet of the base, angling across the property line just enough to cast visual doubt on its boundaries. She wasn't blocking access, she was redefining perception, and every time Nathan looked outside, there was some minor shift. Trash bins left tilted near the edge, children's toys rolled into the lane, construction markers aligned just inside the threshold of legality. It was gaslighting through urban planning. Still, Nathan didn't engage, he documented. He added annotations to his digital map, photographed each intrusion, and dated the images with both embedded metadata and physical backups. He sent no letters, issued no warnings, but maintained absolute readiness to present an unbroken timeline of harassment. When Ruth reviewed the files, she whistled softly through her teeth and said, "This isn't property conflict anymore. This is proxy warfare." She's using civic infrastructure as a weapon. Then, one night, the lights went out. It wasn't a citywide outage or a transformer surge. Only Nathan's rear property lights failed. Motion sensors, Bollard indicators, and pathway illumination. The power box in the garage had been tripped, but only for one circuit. The rest of the house functioned normally. Nathan examined the system, found no signs of a surge, and reset the breaker. Everything came back online. But when he checked the network log, he found a brief encrypted signal spike had occurred at 3:21 a.m., consistent with a low-frequency RF pulse, just strong enough to scramble the sensor handshake on a wireless circuit. It wasn't conclusive proof of tampering, but it was a signature. Someone had used electronic interference to disable part of his system, likely from outside the fence line. Nathan made no public accusation. Instead, he did what he always did. He adapted. The following morning, he disconnected the wireless bridge entirely and reverted the Bollard system to manual operation. He installed a deadbolt-coated override and a pressure seal on the junction box, ensuring that no signal, external or internal, could influence its behavior without physical access. And then, quietly, without fanfare, he filed a security incident report, not with the police, who would have dismissed it as a technical malfunction, but with the insurance firm that had approved his Bollard as a safety feature. It was a chess move. If the city wanted to question the validity of his system, they would have to explain why a licensed insurer considered it not only functional, but critical. Days passed in relative silence, and then came the fire. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a thin curl of smoke rising from the fence post near the alley around 1:15 a.m., captured on Nathan's analog motion camera. The fire itself didn't spread. It was smoldered out before it could reach the property line, but it had clearly been started by an ignition source placed at the base of the fence. Not natural, not accidental. The fire marshal later confirmed it was likely caused by improperly discarded flammable material. No suspects, no formal investigation, no mention of intent. But the symbolism was undeniable. This time, Nathan didn't wait. He retained an independent security consultant, a former commercial investigator with a background in municipal asset protection. Within 48 hours, they had installed motion-activated lighting with offline storage, acoustic sensors for after-hours movement, and perimeter detection lines that sent ping logs to an encrypted local drive. Not to spy, not to accuse, just to record, in triplicate, with redundancies. Karen, meanwhile, continued her campaign. She issued a formal letter to the Neighborhood Accessibility Committee, alleging that Nathan's system was responsible for creating a culture of isolation and intimidation. She accused him of weaponizing property to enforce artificial borders and stated that his continued refusal to participate in community dialogue demonstrated a clear intent to dominate shared space through mechanical and legal overreach. It was absurd, but carefully phrased. Designed not to win a legal battle, but to influence administrative perception. Reputation warfare masquerading as civic concern. Then came the city's reply. A scheduled public review was announced, one that would evaluate the presence and future of all privately installed access controls in the district. The wording was neutral. The implications were not. Nathan's case had become precedent. He was now Exhibit A in a debate about whether individuals should be allowed to maintain defensive infrastructure without direct municipal oversight. If the vote went against him, his permit could be revoked retroactively. His system could be ordered dismantled, and Karen would win without ever stepping into a courtroom. But Nathan wasn't alone anymore. Without his prompting, 3 neighbors submitted unsolicited statements to the city, letters affirming the functionality and necessity of his system, citing its role in preserving access during multiple past emergencies. One neighbor, a retired EMT, described how the Bollard had allowed him to escort a paramedic unit through the lane during a critical call. Another pointed out that Karen herself had benefited from the unobstructed access when a delivery truck had blocked her front entrance, forcing her to redirect through the alley. The tide hadn't turned, but the current had shifted. What had started as an isolated conflict had become a community reckoning, and Nathan, with his folders, his patience, and his silence, had earned the role of reluctant anchor. He stood at his kitchen window the night before the review, watching the alley in silence. The Bollard remained lowered, unused but operational, quiet and resolute. Not a weapon, not a monument, just a mechanism. Waiting. The public review was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, but the emails and calls began pouring in on Tuesday evening. Nathan wasn't surprised by the timing. Delays and reschedules were one of the city's favorite tools for exerting invisible pressure without taking responsibility. The official notice stated that the meeting would now be held in a limited-capacity setting at a downtown municipal annex, with public comment limited to written submission only. Ruth called immediately after receiving the update, her voice clipped and focused. They're minimizing exposure. They want to finalize the ruling before too many people take a position. Nathan understood the subtext. The narrative Karen had been building for weeks, him as an aggressive outlier, an overly litigious homeowner with a fetish for control, was being ushered toward administrative legitimacy behind closed doors. He wasn't just fighting for his system anymore. He was fighting against a decision already written in dry ink, waiting only for the formality of a rubber stamp. But something unexpected happened that morning. Nathan arrived at the municipal annex with Ruth and found not an empty hallway or a silent hearing chamber, but a line. Not a long one, 12, maybe 15 people, but enough to make a statement. Neighbors. Not just the ones who had submitted statements in his defense, but others. People he hadn't spoken to in years, some of whom he'd assumed had quietly sided with Karen just to avoid the discomfort of conflict. A woman who ran a daycare on the next street. An older man who once managed city logistics before retiring. Even a man from the local food distribution center who'd used the emergency lane during a power outage 2 winters ago. They weren't loud and they weren't organized, but they were present. Nathan didn't speak to them. He didn't need to. Their presence spoke volumes. The hearing itself was as sterile and procedurally tight as he'd expected. No witnesses. No oral arguments. Just a city representative reading the summary of recommendations into the record. The proposed motion stated that non-city-sanctioned mechanical access control systems shall be prohibited on all publicly designated lanes unless maintained by licensed contractors under municipal agreement. It was written to sound like a safety provision, but in reality, it was a scalpel designed to cut out individuals like Nathan from managing their own safety infrastructure. Ruth submitted their final rebuttal in silence, a thick packet with a simple cover page. Property owner response to administrative overreach. The committee took no questions. The review closed in under 40 minutes. Then, late that night, Nathan received a voicemail. Not from the city, not from Karen, not from Ruth. It came from a man who introduced himself only as a former planning consultant. Someone who claimed to have reviewed the case and wanted to remain anonymous. The message was short. They're trying to make you the example because you followed every rule. If they can take it from you, they can take it from anyone. Nathan saved the message and added it to the growing archive in his encrypted local drive. It wasn't evidence, but it was clarity. 3 days passed with no update. Then, on Saturday morning, Nathan found a large manila envelope taped to his garage door. No return address, no markings except for a city docket number. Inside was the ruling. The motion had passed, but with conditions. Existing privately installed access control systems shall be grandfathered in under a transitional compliance clause, provided that all current safety certifications remain valid and that no further structural modifications occur. It was, effectively, a stay of execution. His system would not be removed. His permit remained intact, but it was now frozen in time. Any repairs, upgrades, or expansions would require full reapplication under the new restrictive clause. Nathan had retained ownership, but not control. They had stopped short of taking his system away, but they had ensured it could never evolve. And Karen? She didn't gloat. She didn't throw a party or parade a victory lap through the alley. No, what she did was more deliberate, more pointed. That same afternoon, a new sign appeared on her side of the fence, small, metallic, perfectly legal in its dimensions. It read, "Private entry, subject to surveillance." Below, it was a camera, cheap, obvious, and likely non-functional, but placed to stare directly across the lane toward Nathan's Bollard. It wasn't surveillance, it was provocation, and Nathan understood it for what it was. A reminder that even if he'd kept his system, he'd lost something else, the right to be left alone. But the next turn didn't come from her. It came from an anonymous source. Ruth received a flash drive via certified courier. No sender, no note. Just a file directory labeled Maple Access Review, Supplemental. Inside were 10 time-stamped videos, all taken from various angles of the alley and surrounding properties. Some clearly from private security systems, others from what looked like mobile devices. They showed Karen's guests repeatedly obstructing the lane. One video capturing her SUV pulling directly over the Bollard area 2 days before it was crushed. Another showed her photographer associate measuring the grade with what appeared to be a fraudulent city badge clipped to his vest. And perhaps most damning, one clip clearly showed a hand, gloved in orange synthetic fabric, prying at the control box behind Nathan's garage just after 3 p.m. They hadn't submitted this evidence because the rules didn't want it, but now it existed. Ruth immediately filed it with the city ombudsman's office and submitted a formal complaint alleging administrative negligence in the city's review process. The response came within 48 hours. An internal audit would be conducted. The compliance officer who had overseen Nathan's case was reassigned. The motion wasn't reversed, but the city issued a statement acknowledging unverified external activity affecting assessment integrity. It was bureaucratic language for, "We messed up and won't admit it." The final blow came quietly. Karen put her house on the market 2 weeks later. No announcement, no neighborhood farewell. Just a real estate sign placed discreetly beside the hedge. The listing was handled through an out-of-state broker, and within a month the property had sold. Cash deal, no contingencies, and the buyer never introduced themselves in person. Nathan watched the moving truck pull away on a gray morning in late spring and felt nothing. Not relief, not victory, just an exhale that had been caught in his chest for months. The system remained. The Bollard still rose and fell when commanded, but Nathan rarely used it now. He didn't need to. It wasn't about asserting authority anymore. It was about knowing he had it, even when no one was looking. The alley was quieter now, not in the way that silence usually settles after conflict, but in the way space itself changes once a sustained pressure is released. Nathan found himself stepping outside more often without any particular intention, standing at the edge of the path and simply looking at the lane, not as a front line or a territorial marker, but as what it had always been, an emergency access route, carved through the margins of private ownership, meant to serve not as a symbol, but a function. The Bollard remained firmly embedded at the center, its steel surface worn smooth from exposure but untouched by vandalism since the day Karen's moving truck had disappeared over the horizon. Her house, now occupied by a quiet family from the West Coast, showed no signs of inherited hostility. They kept to themselves, waved when they saw him, and never once parked near the line. Nathan didn't dismantle any of the new security upgrades, nor did he remove the motion sensors, the acoustic array, or the redundant logging system he'd installed during the height of the conflict. But he no longer checked the logs daily, nor did he monitor the alerts unless notified by his consultant. These systems were no longer defensive weapons. They were simply infrastructure, the digital equivalent of a lock on a door, neither paranoid nor aggressive, just present. The days stretched longer, lighter, and with the resolution of the review hanging quietly in his file drawer, Nathan returned his focus to his consulting work, updating a risk evaluation plan for a data center build on the eastern seaboard. It felt good to return to problems he could measure, analyze, and solve without navigating a maze of vendettas masquerading as procedure. Yet, even in peace, memory lingered. He found himself pausing when hearing a loud engine in the alley, eyes instinctively glancing toward the window, waiting for the pattern to repeat. But it never did. What had once been a weekly stressor had vanished, not through confrontation or capitulation, but through attrition, a slow erosion of will, evidence, and credibility on Karen's part that finally severed her from the very structure she had tried to manipulate. And while Nathan never received an apology, never heard her admit fault or acknowledge the legitimacy of what he had built, he no longer needed her to. Vindication had never been his goal. Continuity was. He spoke with Ruth only once more in person after the case closed, over coffee in a cafe 3 neighborhoods away. She asked if he planned to pursue a claim for damages, reputational harm, administrative obstruction, procedural delay. He said no. The cost of pursuit was higher than the damage itself, and he had already spent enough time proving what should have never been questioned. She nodded and handed him a folder with the final settlement letter from the Ombudsman's audit, confirming that his system would remain registered under permanent conditional approval. That phrase, once irritating in its bureaucratic vagueness, now felt like a quiet badge of resilience. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but intact. There were still moments when the absurdity of it all struck him. How a safety system designed to protect others had become a legal battleground. How enforcement bodies had turned procedural ambiguity into a weapon. And how one person's ego had almost rewritten the very idea of what was necessary and what was excessive. But these thoughts no longer carried weight. They passed like gusts against a closed window, recognized but irrelevant. One evening in early summer, as the cicadas hummed with a mechanical rhythm and the sky burned with an amber hue, Nathan walked to the edge of the alley and watched the hydraulic bollard lower and rise in a test cycle, its movement smooth, methodical, unquestioned. He placed a hand on the metal briefly, feeling the residual heat from the day's sun. The system had not changed, but the man who had built it had. And sometimes that was the victory no one noticed.